The cantina buzzed with voices from a dozen different worlds. Traders, diplomats, and travelers filled the curved tables of Station Aurora, the neutral meeting point where species came together in peace. The air smelled of exotic spices and recycled atmosphere, while soft music played from hidden speakers. Commander Jake Murphy sat at a corner table, nursing his coffee and reading reports on his tablet. The human officer preferred quiet spots where he could work without interruption. But tonight, quiet was impossible. At the center table sat Zefkar, a massive reptilian warrior whose scales gleamed green and gold under cantina lights. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, with muscles that rippled beneath his ceremonial armor. His people, the Velthari, were known throughout the galaxy as fierce fighters and proud warriors. Zefkar's voice boomed across the room as he told stories to anyone who would listen. His audience included a mix of species, blue-skinned Andorians, insectoid Kethmori, and even a few other humans. They hung on his every word as he described battles from distant worlds. And then Zefkar said, spread his arms wide, I executed the spiral of eternal silence. The enemy champion fell before he could even see my blade move. It was over in 3 heartbeats. The crowd murmured in appreciation. Jake glanced up from his tablet, mildly interested. He had heard stories about Velthari combat techniques before, but this one was new to him. Tell us more about the spiral technique, requested a trader with cybernetic implants covering half his face. Is it some kind of weapon? Zefkar laughed, a sound like distant thunder. No weapon but my body and my training. The spiral of eternal silence is the greatest combat technique ever created. It has been passed down through my family for 300 years. No enemy has ever survived it. No opponent has ever countered it. He stood up, his massive form casting shadows across nearby tables. Watch closely, he said, beginning a slow, flowing movement with his arms. The spiral creates confusion in the enemy's mind. They cannot track where the real attack comes from. By the time they understand what is happening, they're already dead. Jake watched with professional interest. As a military officer, he appreciated skilled combat techniques. But something in Zefkar's tone bothered him. The alien spoke as if his technique was beyond question, beyond improvement. The beauty of the spiral, Zefkar continued, lies in its perfection. Every movement serves a purpose. Every step follows ancient wisdom. It is not just fighting, it is art. It is philosophy. It is the very essence of what makes the Velthari superior warriors. At a small table near the wall, Lieutenant Amy Carter looked up from her own tablet. She had been quietly reviewing tactical data, but Zefkar's words caught her attention. Amy was a tactical analyst, trained to study combat patterns and find weaknesses in enemy strategies. Her job was to break down fighting techniques and figure out how to counter them. Amy was smaller than most humans in the cantina, with short brown hair and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple uniform that identified her as military intelligence. Most people overlooked her, which was exactly how she preferred it. Perfect technique, she muttered under her breath, making a note on her tablet. There's no such thing. Zefkar continued his demonstration, moving through a series of complex motions. His movements were indeed impressive, fluid yet powerful, creating afterimages that confused the eye. Several patrons applauded when he finished. The spiral of eternal silence cannot be taught outsiders, Zefkar declared proudly. It requires the mind of a Velthari warrior. It demands understanding of the eternal hunt that defines our people. Lesser species simply lack the capacity to comprehend its depth. Amy's fingers paused over her tablet. She had analyzed combat techniques from dozens of species during her career. Each one claimed their methods were special, unique, or superior. Each one had weaknesses that could be exploited once you understood the underlying principles. Furthermore, Zefkar said, his voice growing louder, the technique adapts to any situation. Against fast opponents, it becomes quicker. Against strong opponents, it becomes more precise. Against multiple enemies, it creates multiple spirals. It is truly the perfect kill. Perfect, Amy repeated quietly, shaking her head. Nothing's perfect. Her comment was barely audible, but Zefkar's enhanced hearing caught it. His golden eyes scanned the cantina until they found her small table. Did someone question perfection of Velthari combat arts? The cantina grew quiet. Conversation stopped as patrons sensed potential conflict. Jake looked up from his reports, recognizing the dangerous tone in the alien's voice. Amy continued typing on her tablet, seemingly unaware of the attention she had drawn. I said nothing's perfect. Every system has flaws. Every technique can be countered if you understand how it works. Zefkar's scales darkened with anger. You dare insult the ancient wisdom of my people? You, a soft human who has never faced real combat. Jake started to rise from his seat, ready to intervene before things escalated. But Amy remained calm, finally looking up from her tablet to meet Zefkar's glare. I'm not insulting anything, she said evenly. I'm stating a fact. Perfect techniques don't exist because perfect opponents don't exist. Every fighting style is designed to exploit specific weaknesses or assumptions. Change those assumptions, and you can counter the technique. Impossible, Zefkar roared. The spiral of eternal silence has never been defeated, not once in 3 centuries. Amy shrugged. Maybe it just hasn't met the right opponent yet. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Other patrons watched nervously, unsure whether they were about to witness a diplomatic incident or actual violence. Zefkar's hands moved to the ceremonial weapons at his belt. You speak like someone who has never faced a true warrior, he said coldly. Your human arrogance blinds you to realities beyond your comprehension. Maybe, Amy said, saving her work and closing her tablet. Or maybe your pride blinds you to possibilities you've never considered. She stood up, revealing her small stature next to the towering alien, but her calm confidence filled the space between them. I've made a career out of analyzing combat techniques, breaking them down, finding their weaknesses. Every single one has had flaws, once you know where to look. Zefkar stared down at her, his reptilian features twisted with disbelief and rage. Around them, the cantina held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The perfect technique was about to meet human curiosity. And in Amy Carter's experience, curiosity always won. The tension in the cantina grew thick enough to cut. Zefkar towered over Amy, his golden eyes blazing with fury. His massive hands flexed at his sides, and several patrons quietly moved away from nearby tables. Human, Zefkar said, his voice low and dangerous. You speak of things you cannot possibly understand. The spiral of eternal silence is not merely a fighting technique. It is the embodiment of 3,000 years of Velthari warrior culture. It represents the perfect balance between mind, body, and spirit. Amy looked up at him without flinching. Culture and tradition are important, but they don't make a technique unbeatable. Every fighting style reflects the assumptions and limitations of the people who created it. Jake Murphy stood up from his table, recognizing the signs of an escalating situation. He had seen enough bar fights start over smaller insults. Amy, maybe we should... No, Zefkar interrupted, raising one massive hand. Let the human speak. I am curious to hear how she believes her primitive species could comprehend Velthari perfection. Amy tilted her head, studying the alien warrior like he was a puzzle to solve. Primitive is an interesting word choice. Humans might not be the strongest or fastest species in the galaxy, but we have one advantage that seems to surprise everyone we meet. And what is that? Zefkar asked mockingly. We adapt, Amy said simply. We study, we learn, we take things apart to see how they work, then figure out how to do them better. It's not arrogance, it's curiosity. The alien warrior's scales rippled with amusement. You think curiosity can defeat 3 centuries of perfect technique? Child, I have fought against every major species in this sector. Kethmoy berserkers with their four-armed fury, Andorian ice fighters with their cold precision, silicon-based rock creatures that feel no pain. All fell before the spiral. Because they probably tried to fight it head-on, Amy replied. They used their own traditional methods against yours. But what if someone approached it differently? What if someone treated it like a problem to solve instead of an enemy to defeat? Zefkar laughed, the sound echoing through the cantina. You speak, as if combat is some kind of mathematical equation. Fighting is art. It is instinct. It is the spirit of the hunt flowing through warrior blood. Maybe, Amy said, but every art has rules. Every instinct follows patterns. And every pattern can be analyzed. She pulled out her tablet again, quickly bringing up a display that showed movement analysis software. Look, I've been recording your demonstration. Even in those few minutes, I can see recurring elements, timing patterns, angular relationships, spatial sequences, numbers and graphs. Zefkar sneered. This is why humans will never understand true combat. You reduce everything to cold data, while missing the soul of warfare. Amy looked around the cantina, noting the mixed crowd of species watching their exchange. Tell me something, Zefkar, in those 300 years, has any Velthari warrior ever improved on this technique? Has anyone found a way to make it more effective? Improve on perfection? The alien looked genuinely confused by the question. That is impossible. The spiral of eternal silence is complete. It needs no improvement. And there's the problem, Amy said quietly. Nothing that stops evolving stays perfect for long. Jake moved closer, sensing the conversation was heading toward dangerous territory. Amy, what are you thinking? She looked at him, then back at Zefkar. I'm thinking about a challenge. Zefkar claims his technique is unbeatable. I think every technique can be countered. There's only one way to find out who's right. The cantina fell completely silent. Even the background music seemed to fade as everyone strained to hear what would come next. Zefkar's eyes narrowed. You challenge me to combat? A small human against a Velthari warrior? That is not bravery. It is suicide. Not combat, Amy corrected. Analysis. Give me 3 chances to face your perfect technique. If I can't counter it after 3 attempts, I'll publicly acknowledge that Velthari combat methods are superior to human analytical techniques. And if you somehow succeed? Zefkar asked, though his tone suggested he considered the possibility absurd. Then you admit that human adaptability can overcome alien perfection. The warrior studied her for a long moment. Around them, other patrons whispered among themselves, placing formal bets on the outcome. Most seemed to favor the 8-foot reptilian warrior over the small human analyst. You understand, Zefkar said slowly, that the spiral of eternal silence is designed to kill. I cannot simply reduce its effectiveness for your comfort. Amy nodded. I understand the risks. Station Aurora has medical facilities and resurrection protocols for diplomatic incidents. Besides, I'm not asking you to hold back. A technique is only as good as its full application. Jake grabbed her arm. Amy, this is insane. You're an analyst, not a frontline fighter. You've never faced anything like this. She looked at him with calm confidence. That's exactly why it might work. I don't have preconceptions about how to fight this technique. I can approach it from angles that traditional warriors never consider. Zefkar straightened to his full imposing height. Very well, human. Your challenge is accepted. But know this. When you fail, as you surely will, it will demonstrate once and for all the superiority of Velthari warrior culture over human arrogance. When do we do this? Amy asked, already making notes on her tablet. Now, Zefkar declared, the station has training facilities. We will settle this matter immediately before witnesses from multiple worlds. The cantina erupted in excited conversation as patrons began making plans to watch the confrontation. Some rushed to contact friends, while others started calculating odds and making wagers. Jake shook his head in disbelief. Amy, you just challenged one of the galaxy's most dangerous warriors to prove that his undefeated technique can be beaten. Please tell me you have some kind of plan. Amy smiled, the expression of someone who had just been handed an interesting puzzle. The plan is simple, Jake. I'm going to do what humans do best, which is learn something new. As they prepared to leave for the training facility, Zefkar addressed the crowd. Come, all of you, witness the moment when human pride meets Velthari perfection. See for yourselves why the galaxy's greatest warriors have ruled the stars for millennia. But Amy was already thinking 3 steps ahead, her mind racing through possibilities and variables. She had analyzed the movement patterns she had recorded. She had studied Zethkar's body language and fighting stance. Most importantly, she had identified something the proud warrior probably didn't realize. His perfect technique had one crucial flaw. It had never faced someone whose job was specifically to find flaws. The real challenge was about to begin. The training facility buzzed with excitement as word spread throughout Station Aurora. Within an hour, the observation deck filled with representatives from 24 species, all eager to witness the unusual confrontation between human analysis and Velthari tradition. The facility itself was impressive, a large circular arena with adaptive flooring that could simulate different planetary environments. Advanced sensor arrays lined the walls, designed to record combat data for training purposes. Overhead, holographic displays showed multiple viewing angles for the gathered audience. Zethkar stood in the center of the arena, his ceremonial armor replaced by flexible training gear that still managed to look intimidating. His reptilian features were calm and confident as he surveyed the crowd. This was his element: combat, honor, and the chance to demonstrate Velthari superiority. Amy sat in a designated preparation area, surrounded by portable computers and analysis equipment. She had requisitioned from the station's technical department. Her fingers flew across multiple keyboards as she calibrated sensors and prepared recording programs. To most observers, she looked impossibly small and unprepared for what was coming. Jake stood beside her, still trying to talk sense into the situation. "It's not too late to back down, Amy. No one would think less of you for reconsidering." "I'm not backing down," she replied without looking up from her screens. "This is the most interesting puzzle I've encountered in years." The facility's director, a blue-skinned Andorian named Keth, approached with a formal tablet. "Lieutenant Carter, I need you to acknowledge the risks involved in this demonstration. Velthari combat techniques are extremely dangerous, even in training environments." Amy signed the liability waiver quickly. "I understand, but I also need to request full sensor recording of everything that happens. All angles, all spectrums, maximum detail." "Already arranged," Keth replied. "This event will be thoroughly documented." Zethkar called across the arena, his voice carrying easily to every corner. "Human, are you ready to witness perfection in motion?" "Almost," Amy called back. "But first, I'd like you to explain the philosophy behind your technique. Help me understand what I'm about to face." The alien warrior looked surprised by the request. Most opponents spent their preparation time warming up physically or reviewing their own fighting techniques. But Amy wanted a lecture. "Very well," Zethkar said, moving to the center of the arena. "The spiral of eternal silence is not merely about defeating an enemy. It represents the fundamental truth of Velthari existence, that all life is a hunt, and the hunt must always end with the hunter's victory." He began to move slowly, demonstrating the opening positions. Each movement connects to the next in an endless chain, like the hunting patterns of our ancestors. The spiral creates confusion because it mimics the natural flow of predator and prey, but elevated to an art form. Amy recorded everything, her sensors tracking not just the movements, but also environmental factors like air displacement, gravitational effects, and even electromagnetic signatures from Zethkar's nervous system. "The beauty," Zethkar continued, "lies in its mathematical precision combined with spiritual purpose. Every angle has meaning. Every step follows ancient calculations perfected over centuries. It remains alive, adaptive, flowing like water around obstacles." "Interesting," Amy murmured, making notes. "And this technique has never been modified or updated? Why would we chain perfection?" Zethkar asked. "The ancestors who created this technique tested it against every conceivable opponent. They refined it until no flaw remained. For the first demonstration, Keth activated a combat drone, a sleek metal construct designed to simulate various fighting styles. The drone sensors were military-grade, capable of tracking multiple targets simultaneously at superhuman speeds. "Watch carefully," Zethkar announced to the crowd. "See how even advanced technology falls before ancient wisdom." He assumed a ready position, his body perfectly balanced. Then, without warning, he began the spiral of eternal silence. While Zethkar basked in the admiration of the crowd, Amy retreated to her equipment station with Jake following close behind. The arena buzzed with excited conversations as spectators discussed what they had just witnessed. But Amy's focus was entirely on holographic displays floating above her portable computers. "That was incredible," Jake said, watching the replay footage. "I've never seen anything move like that. How are you supposed to fight something that seems to exist in multiple places at once?" Amy's fingers danced across her keyboards, pulling up different analysis windows. "That's exactly the question I needed to answer. And now I think I'm starting to understand how it works." The main display showed a three-dimensional reconstruction of Zefkar's movements during both demonstrations. Colored lines traced his actual position, while ghostly afterimages showed where he appeared to be. The result looked like a complex geometric pattern that hurt to look at directly. "See this?" Amy pointed to a series of wave-like patterns flowing through the data. The spiral isn't just physical movement. It's creating interference patterns that affect multiple types of sensors and biological perception systems. Jake leaned closer, trying to make sense of the swirling colors and mathematical symbols. "You lost me at interference patterns." "Think of it like this," Amy explained, pulling up a simpler diagram. "When you drop two stones in a pond, the ripples interact with each other. Sometimes they add up to create bigger waves. Sometimes they cancel each other out. Zefkar's movements are doing the same thing with electromagnetic fields, air pressure, even gravitational microfluctuations." She highlighted sections of the recording where the combat drone had malfunctioned. His technique specifically exploits the way most species process sensory information. The spiral creates patterns that overload visual cortex functions, electromagnetic senses, even balance and spatial awareness. "But how does he know to do that?" Jake asked. "This sounds incredibly complex." Amy smiled grimly. "That's the beautiful part. He doesn't need to understand the science behind it. The technique was developed through trial and error over centuries. Every time someone found a partial counter, the Veil theory refined the spiral to overcome it. What we're seeing is the end result of thousands of battles worth of evolutionary pressure." She brought up a new window showing frequency analysis of Zefkar's movements. "Look at these patterns. The spiral operates on multiple frequencies simultaneously. It's like a master key that unlocks vulnerabilities in most known species' sensory systems." "Most known species," Jake repeated. "But what about humans?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Amy pulled up comparative biological data, showing human sensory capabilities alongside those of the drone and Thak. Humans aren't the strongest or fastest species, but our sensory processing is unusual. We rely heavily on pattern recognition and predictive modeling rather than pure sensory input. She highlighted specific neural pathway diagrams. Most species react to immediate sensory data, but humans are constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next. We see patterns everywhere, even when they don't exist. Usually that's a disadvantage in combat. "Usually?" Jake prompted. "But against a technique that relies on creating false patterns to confuse opponents." Amy's eyes lit up with understanding. Maybe human pattern recognition could actually work in reverse. Instead of being confused by the false patterns, we might be able to identify them as false. She began running simulations, feeding the recorded spiral data through models of human visual and cognitive processing. The results were encouraging but not conclusive. "There's something else," Amy continued, highlighting different sections of the recordings. "The technique has to adapt to different opponents, which means it follows decision trees. If this happens, do that. If the opponent responds this way, adjust that way." Decision trees can be mapped, Jake realized, beginning to understand her approach. "Exactly. And once you map the decision tree, you can predict the adaptations." Amy brought up a complex flowchart that looked like a maze of interconnected possibilities. The spiral might seem chaotic and adaptive, but underneath it's following logical rules. She paused the recording at the moment when Zefkar adjusted his technique to counter Thak's defenses. "See this transition?" He moved from pattern alpha to pattern beta in response to Thak's defensive posture. "That's not instinct. That's programmed response." "So you think you can predict his moves?" "I think I can predict his adaptation patterns," Amy corrected, "which might be even better." She began sketching out tactical approaches on a virtual whiteboard. The spiral has three main phases. First, the initial disorientation phase where he establishes the false pattern matrix. Second, the adaptation phase where he adjusts to the opponent's responses. Third, the exploitation phase where he delivers the finishing attack. Jake studied her notes. And you think you can disrupt these phases? I think I can turn them against him, Amy said with growing confidence. The spiral's strength is its adaptability, but that also means it's reactive. It has to respond to what the opponent does. If I can control what it's responding to... She pulled up video footage from Earth, showing various human martial arts and military training exercises. Humans have been developing adaptive combat techniques for thousands of years, too. We just took a different approach than most species. The footage showed examples of misdirection, feints, and psychological warfare from human fighting traditions. While other species develop techniques to overwhelm opponents with superior speed, strength, or special abilities, humans learn to win by understanding and manipulating their enemies' expectations. You're going to try to outthink a technique that's been perfected over 3 centuries? Jake asked skeptically. I'm going to try to make it think itself into a corner, Amy replied. Every adaptive system has limits. Every decision tree has terminal branches. I just need to find the inputs that lead to outputs I can counter. She began preparing for her first attempt, loading specific analysis programs into her equipment, and setting up real-time monitoring systems. The first attempt is going to be pure data gathering. I need to see how the spiral responds to human movement patterns and reaction times. Amy, Jake said seriously, this isn't computer simulation. If you're wrong about any of this, Zethkar could seriously hurt you. She looked up from her preparations, meeting his concerned gaze. Jake, in my career I've analyzed combat techniques from 47 different species. Every single one of them claimed their method was special, unique, or unbeatable. Every single one had exploitable weaknesses once you understood the underlying principles. But none of them were the spiral of eternal silence. No, Amy agreed, but they were all created by intelligent beings trying to solve combat problems within the limitations of their biology and culture. This technique might be more sophisticated than most, but it's still bound by the same fundamental constraints. She stood up, stretching muscles that would soon be tested in ways they had never experienced. Besides, I have one advantage that none of Zethkar's previous opponents had, which is... Amy smiled, the expression of someone who enjoyed solving impossible puzzles. I'm not trying to beat him. I'm trying to understand him. Once you truly understand how something works, figuring out how to counter it becomes much easier. Across the arena, Zethkar was demonstrating additional movement patterns for interested spectators, clearly enjoying the attention and respect his technique commanded. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with superior combat skills. He's about to learn something new about humans, Amy said, checking her equipment one final time. We might not be the strongest fighters in the galaxy, but we're definitely the most stubborn students. Jake watched her final preparations with a mixture of admiration and worry. Just remember, you've got 2 more attempts after this one. Don't try to solve everything in the first round. Don't worry, Amy replied, walking toward the arena floor. I'm planning to fail the first attempt. You're planning to fail? She looked back with a grin that reminded Jake why Amy Carter was considered one of the best tactical analysts in human space. Sometimes the best way to understand a system is to let it succeed exactly the way it's supposed to. Then you know what success looks like, and you can figure out how to prevent it. The first round was about to begin, and Amy was already 3 steps ahead. Amy walked onto the arena floor wearing simple training clothes that looked almost comical next to Zethkar's imposing form. The crowd murmured among themselves, many expressing doubt about the human's chances. She appeared small, unprepared, and vastly outmatched by the towering reptilian warrior. But Amy's mind was racing with calculations and possibilities. Her equipment continued recording from the sidelines, ready to capture every detail of what was about to happen. This first attempt wasn't about winning. It was about learning. Are you ready, human? Zethkar asked, assuming his opening stance. His golden eyes gleamed with confidence, and his scaled skin reflected the arena lights. Perhaps you would prefer to observe one more demonstration before facing the spiral yourself? Actually, Amy said, not moving into any recognizable fighting position, I'd like to ask you something first. You mentioned that the spiral represents the eternal hunt. Could you explain what that means on a practical level? Zefkar looked puzzled. Most opponents use their preparation time for physical warm-ups or mental focus. But this human wanted to discuss philosophy. The eternal hunt, he said slowly, represents a fundamental truth that all life is about predator and prey relationships. The spiral of eternal silence embodies this truth by making the practitioner the perfect predator, impossible to track, impossible to escape, impossible to defeat. Amy nodded thoughtfully. And the spiritual aspect? You mentioned achieving a meditative state. Indeed. Zefkar seemed pleased by her interest, even if he found the timing strange. The spiral requires complete unity between mind and body. The warrior must enter a state where conscious thought disappears and instinct takes control. Only then can the movements achieve their full power. Fascinating, Amy said, still making no move to prepare for combat. So the technique actually requires you to stop thinking consciously about what you're doing? Precisely. Conscious thought is too slow for true combat. The spiral flows from deeper wisdom, from the hunting instincts that have guided my people for millennia. Amy smiled. That's very helpful information. Thank you. Zefkar's expression shifted to mild confusion. You are welcome. But why do you ask these questions now? These questions now? Because understanding my opponent is part of my technique. Amy replied. Now I'm ready. She finally moved into what looked like a basic human martial arts stance. Feet shoulder-width apart, hands raised in a simple guard position. It was competent but unremarkable, nothing that would intimidate anyone familiar with serious combat. The crowd settled into expectant silence. The massive displays around the arena showed multiple angles of both fighters, with Amy looking impossibly small compared to her opponent. Begin when ready, announced Director Kef in the observation area. Zefkar nodded formally, then began his approach. His movement started slowly, deliberately, as he initiated the first phase of the spiral of eternal silence. Amy watched intently, her analytical mind cataloging every detail even as she prepared to experience the technique firsthand. She could see the moment when Zefkar's movement shifted from normal locomotion to the spiral pattern. The effect was immediate and disorienting. Zefkar seemed to multiply, his form splitting into overlapping afterimages that made it impossible to track his real position. The air around him shimmered with electromagnetic disturbances that Amy's equipment registered as complex interference patterns. But instead of immediately trying to counter the technique, Amy did something unexpected. She began moving erratically, using rapid, unpredictable movements that had no apparent pattern or purpose. Her strategy was based on chaos theory principles. If the spiral relied on predicting and adapting to opponent behavior, then completely random behavior might disrupt its ability to establish effective patterns. The approach partially worked. Zefkar's spiral had to constantly adjust as Amy's movements provided no consistent input for his adaptive algorithms. His afterimages flickered and wavered as the technique struggled to maintain coherence against truly chaotic opposition. For several seconds, Amy managed to stay ahead of the spiral's adaptation cycles. Her random movements prevented Zefkar from establishing the stable pattern matrix that was essential for the technique's second phase. The crowd murmured in surprise. This wasn't how combats usually went. Most opponents either tried to match the Velthari's sophisticated technique with their own fighting skills, or they froze up under the sensory overload. But Amy was doing something completely different. Zefkar's golden eyes narrowed as he realized what was happening. His centuries of training kicked in, and he began adapting the spiral to account for random behavior patterns. The technique evolved in real time, developing new approaches to deal with chaotic opposition. Amy felt the moment when the spiral successfully adapted. The disorienting effect suddenly intensified, and she found herself struggling to maintain balance and spatial awareness. Her random movements became less coordinated as the neurological disruption effects overwhelmed her human nervous system. But she kept moving, kept gathering data. Even as the spiral began to dominate the engagement, her equipment recorded everything. The exact frequencies that disrupted human neural functions, the specific adaptation patterns Zefkar used, the timing sequences that allowed the technique to evolve. When the spiral entered its final phase, Amy was ready for it. She had positioned herself exactly where her analysis predicted the finishing attack would come from. But instead of trying to block or dodge, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She stepped directly into the attack. The movement caught Zefkar off guard. His finishing technique was designed to exploit opponents who were trying to escape or defend. Amy's unexpected advance disrupted his timing and forced him to modify the attack at the last second. Instead of a precise, devastating strike, Zefkar had to settle for a controlled takedown that put Amy on the ground without seriously injuring her. The spiral's perfect form had been compromised, even though it had still achieved victory. Amy lay on the arena floor for a moment, gathering her breath and processing what she had experienced. Every nerve in her body felt like it had been through an electrical storm, and her vision was still filled with phantom afterimages. But she was smiling. "Yield," she called out, raising one hand in a formal surrender gesture. Zefkar stood over her, breathing heavily from the exertion of maintaining the spiral against chaotic opposition. "You fought strangely human. I have never faced an opponent who moved with such randomness." Amy accepted his offered hand and let him help her to her feet. Random movement was just the first test. I needed to see how your technique adapts to unpredictable input. "And what did you learn?" he asked, genuine curiosity mixing with lingering confusion. "That your spiral is even more sophisticated than I initially thought," Amy admitted, "but also that it has adaptation limits. When you had to modify the finishing sequence, the technique lost some of its precision." The crowd was buzzing with discussion about the unusual first round. Many spectators were trying to understand what they had just witnessed, while others placed new bets based on Amy's unexpected performance. Jake met Amy at the edge of the arena, offering her water and a towel. "That looked incredibly dangerous. Are you all right?" "Better than all right," Amy replied, wiping sweat from her face. "That was incredibly educational." She looked at the data streaming across her portable displays, already identifying patterns and possibilities for her second attempt. Zefkar was right about one thing. The spiral is adaptive, but every adaptive system has boundaries and limitations. "And you found some?" Amy's smile grew wider. "I found several, and now I know exactly what to try next." Across the arena, Zefkar was accepting congratulations from impressed spectators, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. The human's strange behavior had forced him to work harder than expected, and her questions about the spiral's philosophy had made him think about aspects of the technique he normally took for granted. For the first time in years, Zefkar found himself wondering if there might be things about his perfect technique that he didn't fully understand. Amy was counting on exactly that uncertainty. During the break between rounds, Amy sat surrounded by holographic displays, showing the data from her first encounter with the spiral of eternal silence. Her fingers moved rapidly across multiple keyboards as she processed the information, looking for patterns within patterns. "The adaptation sequence is fascinating," she muttered to Jake, who was still trying to convince her to reconsider the whole endeavor. "Look at these neural interference frequencies. The spiral doesn't just create random disruption. It specifically targets the wavelengths that each species uses for spatial processing." Jake handed her another bottle of water. "Amy, you nearly collapsed during that first round. Your vital signs were all over the place. But I stayed conscious and mobile longer than either the drone or Thak," she pointed out. "Human neural architecture is more resistant to the disorientation effects than I expected. We might actually have a natural advantage here." She pulled up comparative analysis charts showing how different species' nervous systems responded to the spiral's electromagnetic interference. Most species rely on specialized organs for spatial awareness, echolocation, electromagnetic sensing, gravitational detection. But humans use a combination of visual, auditory, and inner ear systems with extensive backup processing. Backup processing? Redundancy, Amy explained. When one system gets confused, humans automatically shift to other methods of maintaining spatial awareness. It's why humans are harder to disorient than most species. We have multiple independent systems doing the same job. Across the arena, Zefkar was also analyzed in the first round, though his approach was more traditional. He moved through slow-motion versions of the spiral patterns, reviewing where Amy's chaotic movements had forced him to adapt. The human fights without honor or technique, commented a Velthari observer who had joined the crowd. Her movements were crude and purposeless. Perhaps, Zefkar replied thoughtfully, but they were also effective at disrupting the spiral's pattern establishment. I have never encountered opposition that completely ignored traditional combat principles. Surely you do not consider such random flailing to be a serious challenge? Zefkar paused in his practice movements. Any opposition that forces adaptation is worthy of consideration. The spiral succeeded, but not in the manner I expected. Back at her equipment station, Amy finished her analysis and stood up with new determination. I think I understand the resonance frequencies now, she announced to Jake. The spiral creates interference patterns, but patterns can be countered with other patterns. What are you planning this time? Instead of fighting the spiral, Amy said, I'm going to join it. Jake looked alarmed. That sounds even more dangerous than random movement. Actually, it might be safer. Amy began stretching and preparing for the second round. The spiral's disorientation effects come from being the only source of pattern interference in the combat space. But what happens when there are two interference sources? She walked back onto the arena floor, this time moving with more purpose and confidence. The crowd noticed a change in her demeanor immediately. Where she had seemed almost casual before the first round, now she carried herself like someone with a specific plan. Ready for your second attempt, human? Zefkar asked, noting her altered stance and expression. I think so, Amy replied. But first, another question about the spiral's philosophy. Zefkar nodded, seeming less surprised by her unconventional approach this time. You mentioned that the spiral represents the eternal hunt, Amy said. But in nature, successful hunters often use pack tactics. Has anyone ever tried to execute the spiral in coordination with other fighters? The question caught Zefkar off guard. The spiral of eternal silence is an individual technique. It requires complete focus and unity of purpose. Multiple practitioners would interfere with each other. Interfere how? The electromagnetic patterns would create conflicts, resonance feedback. The spirals would disrupt each other rather than the enemy. Amy smiled. Resonance feedback. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Before Zefkar could ask what she meant, Amy assumed her starting position. But this time, instead of a simple martial arts stance, she began moving in slow, flowing patterns that looked vaguely familiar. Begin when ready, Director Kev announced. Zefkar initiated a spiral, confident that his adaptation for the first round would handle whatever strange strategy the human employed next. But as the spiral of eternal silence began to establish its pattern matrix, Amy started her own movement sequence. She had studied the recordings from the first round extensively, identifying the basic mathematical relationships that govern the spiral's geometry. Amy couldn't replicate the spiral exactly. She lacked a Velthari's specialized biology and centuries of training. But she could create something similar, a crude approximation that operated on some of the same principles. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Two interference patterns began competing for dominance in the same space, creating electromagnetic chaos that confused both fighters and spectators. Amy's improvised spiral was clumsy and incomplete compared to Zefkar's perfected technique. But it didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to create enough interference to disrupt the Velthari's pattern establishment. The audience watched in amazement as both fighters seemed to split into multiple overlapping images. The arena's sensor arrays struggled to track what was happening as conflicting electromagnetic signatures created a storm of false readings. Zefkar found himself in a situation he had never experienced. The spiral of eternal silence relied on being the dominant pattern in the combat space, but Amy's crude mimicry was creating competing patterns that interfere with his technique's core functionality. His centuries of training kicked in as he tried to adapt. The spiral evolved, attempting to counter the interference by shifting to different frequencies and geometric configurations. But every time he adapted, Amy's pattern shifted too, maintaining the disruption. The battle became a strange dance of competing spirals, neither fighter able to establish dominance. Amy's technique was clearly inferior. Her movements were rough, and her pattern generation was unstable. But the mere existence of her interference was enough to prevent Zethkar's perfected spiral from achieving its full effect. For several minutes, they moved around each other in an increasingly complex pattern of action and counteraction. Amy was clearly struggling to maintain her crude spiral, sweat pouring down her face from the mental and physical effort required. But she was learning with every second. Her analytical mind cataloged how Zethkar's spiral adapted to interference, what frequencies he shifted to when challenged, how the geometric patterns evolved under stress. The end came when Amy's improvised technique finally broke down under the strain. Her pattern collapsed, leaving her vulnerable to Zethkar's now dominant spiral. But instead of the quick, decisive victory he usually achieved, Zethkar found that maintaining his technique against sustained interference had drained him significantly. His finishing attack was slower and less precise than normal, giving Amy time to attempt a counter. She couldn't avoid defeat, but she managed to turn what had been a devastating blow into a controlled fall that left her conscious and relatively uninjured. "Yield," she gasped from the arena floor, but her expression was one of satisfaction rather than defeat. Zethkar stood over her, breathing heavily and looking genuinely shaken. "How did you—" "That was not possible. No one can execute even a portion of the spiral without decades of training." Amy accepted his help getting up, her legs unsteady, but her mind clear. "I couldn't execute your spiral, but I could create enough interference to disrupt it. Same principle as signal jamming in electronic warfare." The crowd was buzzing with excitement and confusion. Many had never seen anything like the competing spiral patterns, and none had expected a human to force the legendary Velthari technique into an extended engagement. "That was incredible," Jake said as Amy rejoined him at the equipment station. "You actually made his perfect technique struggle." "More than that," Amy replied, reviewing the new data from her sensors. "I forced him to show me his adaptation protocols under stress. Look at these pattern shifts. Now I know exactly how the spiral responds when its core functionality is threatened." She pulled up comparative analysis from both rounds, highlighting the differences in Zethkar's technique when challenged by chaos versus interference. He has to maintain much tighter control when dealing with competing patterns. Less room for adaptation, more predictable responses. "So what's the plan for round 3? Amy's smile was confident and determined. "Round 3 is where I stop studying the technique and start solving it." Across the arena, Zethkar was having his own moment of realization. For the first time in his career, his perfect technique had been forced to operate outside its optimal parameters. The human had done something that should have been impossible, and she had clearly learned from the experience. The final round would determine whether 3 centuries of Velthari martial perfection could overcome human adaptability and analysis. Neither fighter was certain of the outcome anymore. The arena fell silent as Amy prepared for her final attempt. 2 rounds of data had given her unprecedented insight into the spiral of eternal silence, and her portable computers hummed with processing power as they ran final calculations on her strategy. Jake watched nervously as Amy reviewed her analysis one last time. "Are you sure about this approach? You've already proven that the technique isn't unbeatable. Proving it can be disrupted isn't the same as actually beating it," Amy replied, her eyes focused on the holographic displays floating around her. "This last round is about more than just countering Zethkar's technique. It's about demonstrating something fundamental about human problem-solving capabilities." She gestured to the complex mathematical models on her screens. "Look at this. The spiral of eternal silence isn't just a fighting technique. It's a 3-dimensional equation expressed through movement. Every step, every gesture, every timing sequence follows mathematical principles. And that helps how?" Amy's smile was confident and slightly fierce. "Because every equation can be solved. And solving equations is what humans do best." Across the arena, Zethkar was also preparing, but his confidence had been shaken by the previous rounds. For the first time in his life, his perfect technique had been challenged by approaches he had never encountered or imagined. "The human fights without honor," muttered a Velthari observer. "She uses trickery and strange methods instead of honest combat. Perhaps," Zethkar replied, but his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. But her methods have forced adaptations that centuries of traditional opponents never required. There is a form of honor in forcing improvement through challenge. He looked across at Amy, who was now walking onto the arena floor with steady, purposeful steps. She approaches combat like a puzzle to be solved rather than an enemy to be defeated. It is unusual. Amy took her position in the center of the arena, but this time her stance was completely different. Instead of preparing to fight or attempting to replicate spiral movements, she stood perfectly still with her eyes closed, apparently doing nothing at all. "Human," Zethkar called, confused by her lack of preparation. "Are you ready to begin?" "Almost," Amy replied without opening her eyes. "I'm just running through the final calculations." The crowd murmured in confusion. No one had ever seen a fighter do mathematics immediately before combat. But Amy was visualizing the three-dimensional space around her, mapping probability zones based on her analysis of Zethkar's movement patterns. She opened her eyes and looked directly at the Velthari warrior. "Ready." "Begin when ready," Director Keth announced. Zethkar initiated a spiral, but this time he was cautious and deliberate. He had learned from the previous rounds that this human was unpredictable and required careful attention. The spiral of eternal silence began its familiar pattern, creating the mesmerizing afterimages and electromagnetic interference that had defeated every opponent for 3 centuries. But Amy didn't react the way previous opponents had. Instead of trying to track Zethkar's movements or defend against his attacks, Amy began moving in a completely different pattern. Her movements appeared random at first, but they were actually based on her mathematical analysis of the spiral's constraints. Every fighting technique, no matter how sophisticated, operated within physical and logical limitations. The spiral had to maintain certain geometric relationships to function properly. It required specific timing sequences to build and maintain its interference patterns. Most importantly, it needed predictable opponent behavior to trigger its adaptive responses. Amy had identified these constraints and was now exploiting them systematically. She moved to positions that forced Zethkar to modify his spiral in specific ways. Each modification narrowed his options for the next sequence, gradually constraining the technique's adaptive capabilities. She was essentially solving the spiral like a complex puzzle, determining what inputs would produce which outputs. The effect on Zethkar was remarkable. For the first time in his career, he found his perfect technique being guided and controlled by his opponent. Amy wasn't fighting the spiral. She was directing it. "Impossible," breathed a spectator who understood combat techniques. She was making him dance to her pattern instead of his own. Amy's movements became more confident as her strategy proved successful. She had correctly predicted Zethkar's adaptive responses and was now 3 steps ahead of his technique's evolution cycles. The spiral tried to compensate, shifting to different frequencies and geometric configurations. But every adaptation had been anticipated in Amy's mathematical models. She moved precisely to the positions that would force the next predictable response. Zethkar realized what was happening and tried to break free from the pattern Amy was imposing. But the spiral centuries of refinement had made it too rigid. The technique had been optimized for mathematical perfection, which meant it followed predictable rules that could be exploited by someone who understood those rules. The breakthrough moment came when Amy recognized that Zethkar's next adaptation would lock him into a pattern with only one possible conclusion. She had successfully constrained the infinite possibilities of the spiral down to a single, predictable sequence. Instead of waiting for that sequence to complete, Amy stepped directly into the path of the inevitable finishing attack. But this time, she knew exactly when and where it would come. She had calculated the precise timing, angle, and force that Zethkar would be required to use. As the attack came, Amy moved with surgical precision. She redirected Zethkar's momentum using a simple human judo principle, using an opponent's force against them. The massive Velthari warrior found himself suddenly airborne, his own power turned against him by someone a fraction of his size. Zethkar crashed to the arena floor with enough force to shake the entire facility. The impact was spectacular but not dangerous. Amy had calculated the throw to be dramatic rather than harmful. The arena fell completely silent. For several seconds, no one moved or spoke as a process would have just happened. Amy stood over the fallen warrior, breathing heavily but victorious. She offered her hand to help Zethkar up, the same courtesy he had shown her in previous rounds. "How?" Zethkar asked as he accepted her assistance. His voice held wonder rather than anger. "The spiral is perfect. It adapts to any situation. How did you turn it against itself?" "Perfect systems are predictable systems," Amy explained, helping the massive alien to his feet. "Your technique is mathematically optimal, which means it follows rules. Once I understood the rules, I could manipulate the inputs to control the outputs." She gestured to her equipment station, where holographic displays showed the mathematical breakdown of their entire encounter. "You were solving a combat equation, but I was solving you solving the combat equation. I stayed one level of analysis ahead of your technique's decision-making process." The crowd erupted in amazement and discussion. Representatives from dozens of species tried to understand what they had witnessed. A human had not only survived the legendary spiral of eternal silence, but had actually turned it against its practitioner. Zethkar stared at the mathematical displays, seeing his perfect technique reduced to numbers and equations. But instead of anger or humiliation, his expression showed fascination and respect. "You have shown me something remarkable human," he said formally. "I believe my technique was perfect because it had never been defeated. But you have revealed that perfection itself can be a form of limitation." Amy nodded. "Every system optimizes for specific conditions. When those conditions change, even perfect systems can become vulnerable. The spiral was designed to defeat traditional combat approaches, but human analytical thinking isn't traditional." She looked around the arena at the mixed crowd of species, all watching their exchange with intense interest. "This isn't about humans being superior fighters. It's about the power of approaching problems from new angles. Your technique is still incredibly sophisticated and effective, but now you know it can be improved." The final round was over, but both Amy and Zethkar realized that something more important than a simple contest had just concluded. They had demonstrated that even the most refined and perfected systems could benefit from fresh perspectives and analytical approaches. The real victory wasn't human over alien, but collaboration over stagnation. The crowd remained stunned in the aftermath of Amy's victory. Whispered conversations in dozens of languages filled the arena as representatives from various species tried to process what they had witnessed. The legendary spiral of eternal silence, undefeated for 3 centuries, had been systematically analyzed and countered by a human tactical analyst. Zethkar stood slowly, shaking his massive head as if clearing away mental fog. The fall hadn't injured him physically, but the defeat had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of combat and perfection. Amy remained nearby, not celebrating her victory, but watching the Velthari warrior with genuine concern. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I calculated the throw to be safe, but you're much heavier than human opponents." "I am unharmed," Zethkar replied, though his voice carried a note of wonder. "But I find myself questioning things I have never questioned before." He looked at his hands, then at Amy's much smaller form. "How does someone your size generate enough force to throw a Velthari warrior?" "I didn't generate the force," Amy explained patiently. "You did. I just redirected it. The principle is called leverage, using mechanical advantage to multiply limited strength. It's one of the oldest human engineering concepts." Jake approached from the equipment station, carrying printouts of the combat analysis. "Amy, these readings are incredible. The computers tracked over 40 distinct mathematical relationships in Zethkar's technique, and you predicted every single adaptive response." Amy accepted the data with satisfaction. Pattern recognition is what humans evolved for. We survived on worlds full of predators by being able to analyze behavior and predict outcomes. It's our species' greatest strength. Zethkar studied the mathematical displays that still floated above Amy's equipment. "You reduced the spiral of eternal silence to numbers and equations. But how did you understand it so quickly? Our warriors spend decades learning to execute even basic elements." "That's exactly why I could analyze it," Amy replied. "I wasn't trying to learn your technique. I was trying to understand it. There's a difference between execution and comprehension." She gestured to holographic models, showing the spiral's geometric patterns. Your training focuses on perfect execution through repetition and muscle memory. But I approached it as an engineering problem. What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are the transformation rules that connect them? A new voice joined the conversation as Director Kef approached with several other station officials. Lieutenant Carter, what you've accomplished here tonight will be studied for years. You've demonstrated principles that could revolutionize how we understand combat techniques across species. That wasn't my goal, Amy said honestly. I just wanted to prove that no system is truly perfect or unbeatable. Every technique reflects the assumptions and limitations of its creators. Zethkar nodded slowly. You have taught me that what I believe of perfection was actually optimization within constraints I never recognize. Exactly, Amy agreed. The spiral of eternal silence is perfectly optimized for defeating opponents who fight using traditional methods. But optimization for specific conditions can create blindness to alternative approaches. She pulled up a comparison chart showing human combat philosophy versus various alien approaches. Most species develop fighting techniques based on their natural advantages, superior strength, speed, special senses, or unique physiology. Humans had none of those advantages, so we learned to win through understanding our enemies better than they understood themselves. This is why your species is both feared and respected, commented a Kethmori observer who had been following the conversation. You do not simply defeat techniques. You comprehend them completely. Amy shrugged. We're naturally curious. When we encounter something we don't understand, our first instinct is to take it apart and figure out how it works. Sometimes that's more powerful than raw fighting ability. Zethkar walked over to the equipment station, studying the detailed analysis of his own technique with growing fascination. These mathematical relationships, I never realized they existed. My training taught me to feel the spiral, not to understand it analytically. Both approaches have value, Amy said, joining him at the displays. Your intuitive mastery allows for fluid execution that my analytical approach can't match. But analytical understanding reveals possibilities for improvement that intuitive mastery might miss. She highlighted specific sections of the data. Look at these adaptation patterns. Your technique automatically adjusts to opponent behavior, but it only has a finite number of response options. What if you consciously added new options based on mathematical analysis? Zethkar's golden eyes widened as he grasped the implications. You suggest combining intuitive execution with analytical understanding? Enhancing the spiral through conscious improvement rather than just traditional repetition. Why not? Amy asked. Your technique is already incredibly sophisticated. Imagine how much more effective it could become with deliberate optimization based on mathematical analysis. Jake watched the exchange with amazement. You're talking about collaborative technique development between species with completely different approaches to combat. That's exactly what we're talking about, Amy confirmed. Zethkar has centuries of refined technique and intuitive mastery. I have analytical tools and pattern recognition abilities. Together, we could develop something better than either approach alone. The arena fell quiet as the implications of this collaboration became clear. Other species representatives began approaching, drawn by the possibility of applying similar analytical approaches to their own combat traditions. Lieutenant Carter, said a blue-skinned Andorian diplomat, would you be willing to analyze our ice-fighting techniques? We have always believed them to be optimal for our physiology. Commander Murphy, added a Kethmori trader, could human analytical methods help us understand why our defensive techniques sometimes fail against certain opponents? Amy looked around at the gathering crowd of interested aliens, each representing combat traditions that had never been subjected to systematic mathematical analysis. I think we might be starting something bigger than just settling a debate about one technique. Zethkar straightened to his full imposing height, but his expression was thoughtful rather than prideful. Human Amy Carter, I formally request that you teach me your analytical methods. In exchange, I will share the complete philosophical and practical knowledge of Velthari combat arts. The offer drew murmurs of amazement from the crowd. Velthari warriors were notoriously protective of their martial secrets, and the idea of cross-species technique sharing was almost unprecedented. I accept, Amy said immediately, but I have a condition. This collaboration has to be open to other species who want to participate. The goal isn't to create human dominance over alien techniques. It's to advance everyone's understanding through shared knowledge. Agreed. Zefkar said formally, let this be the beginning of a new approach to martial development, one that combines traditional mastery with analytical innovation. Director Kess stepped forward with obvious excitement. Station Aurora will be honored to host such a collaborative program. We could establish a permanent facility for interspecies combat analysis and technique development. Amy smiled, realizing that her simple challenge to an alien warrior's boast had evolved into something much more significant. What started as a question about perfect techniques might actually become a new form of diplomacy. Jake shook his head in amazement. Only you, Amy, could turn a bar fight into an interspecies research initiative. The best solutions usually come from combining different perspectives. Amy replied, humans might not be the strongest or fastest fighters in the galaxy, but we're probably the most curious. And curiosity, it turns out, is a pretty effective weapon against assumptions about perfection. As the crowd began to disperse, with many species representatives already making plans for future collaboration, Zefkar approached Amy one final time. You have given me something more valuable than victory or defeat, he said formally. You have given me the understanding that even perfection can be improved through new ways of thinking. Amy nodded. And you've given me the chance to learn that human analytical abilities can be most powerful when combined with the wisdom and experience of other species. The spiral of eternal silence would never be the same. But then again, neither would the assumptions about what made techniques perfect. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't human over alien, but curiosity over certainty. And that was a lesson that would benefit everyone in the galaxy.